Hey guys, Level Cap here. Today I want to talk about, kind of wrap up, give you an overview on the PUBG Invitational Tournament, talk about what went right, what went wrong, and sort of the discussions that came about from this tournament and learning what can be done better next time. We've already seen Brendan Green and even some of the other developers come forward and talk about that they know the PUBG Invitational was not ideal, there was a lot of problems with it, and that they want to fix many things going down the road. So why not discuss some of the better ways to try and fix the tournament, both from a balance perspective and a spectating perspective. Now, a quick overview for those of you who didn't watch the tournament. There was 4 different days of competition. The first day they did solo third-person perspective. Day 2 they did duos third-person perspective. Day 3 they did duos first-person perspective. And then day 4 they did squads third-person perspective. They had a player count in the low 70s each day, and they conducted 3 separate games to conclude an overall winner. Now, I watched all the games and I cataloged some interesting information, came to some interesting conclusions based on the way that the game is designed right now. One thing that I found was that even though there was 3 games to try and determine a winner within each round, none of the people who won their own events won more than 1 single game, which was a little bit disappointing. It feels like 3 games just isn't quite enough to really rule out who the best player is. They took so much time in between rounds and pre-game and post-game and all that the streams ended up being over 3 hours long, sometimes over 4 hours. And we only fit 3 30-minute games into that time period. So definitely they could work on the efficiency of this tournament format, have less downtime in between games, and just keep things moving along faster. We could probably fit in 5 to even 7 games to better conclude who is the best team or who is the best player, depending on the format that you're playing. More games will give you a much better pool to pull from, as we had just a lot of winners who won 1 game and then just barely made it into the top 10 in the 2 remaining games, but they still had enough points to give them the overall victory. 5 to 7 games would probably mean that some of the better players would end up winning 2, maybe even 3 games overall to better conclude who was the official winner of that tournament. Now, having a mixed tournament between third-person perspective and first-person perspective also sparked a lot of debate about which was the better perspective to show for tournament format. They did a few Twitter polls online, and every single poll that I saw was heavily skewed in favor of first-person perspective, as it seemed to cater more towards action. Players were less able to gather tons of intel without exposing themselves to the outside environment, and therefore people might sneak up on other players more frequently, and it just catered to more gunplay early game and mid game. Not necessarily early game all the time. This was a highly competitive tournament, and most of the players had a pretty easy time of avoiding each other altogether. But it was clear without a doubt that many people preferred watching the first-person perspective, as it ended up being, in my opinion, a bit more fair when it came to the end game. When watching the squads in third-person perspective, every single endgame victory went to the team that had the circle positioning. So whoever ended up being in the final circle, whatever that circle chose, ended up winning that game because they generally had better cover. The other team had to push their location, and the third-person camera just ended up being too advantageous to the people with circle positioning. We saw pretty much the complete opposite in first-person perspective, though, even for duos. We saw a few games where the winning player had circle positioning, but decided to be aggressive and push out of the circle positioning for some really cool victories. We also saw the final duo game where Andy Pyro pushes the circle in a 1v2 situation and gets the win. It was really exciting to watch and really cool, and it showed that the final circle position was far less important in first-person perspective than it was in third-person perspective. And I think overall that caters much better to a tournament format rather than just kind of hoping you get the circle position at the end, as that counted for so much in third person. So going forward, I hope PUBG considers focusing primarily on the first-person perspective for their tournament format. Now, another topic that was heavily discussed and debated during the tournament was the actual rules set of the tournament, how the game worked, and some of the underlying rules of PUBG themselves needing to be updated to allow for more entertaining gameplay. One issue that kept cropping up was people abusing the blue zone, just staying way out of bounds, taking damage from the circle, healing through it, being out of combat and using that to get a much higher position on the scoreboard. We saw it a lot in solos, but we also saw it quite a bit in squads. Some of the squads would leave one player way outside of harm's way in the blue zone with a ton of health. We saw this from TSM, and even though their squad got wiped early on and they didn't get involved in combat late game at all, they still had one player out in the blue with a lot of meds able to survive to the very end game and get a really high position at the end, even though they really just didn't contribute to the end game circle or fighting or anything like that. And it was really disappointing to sort of see these tactics being so effective in the tournament, because really you don't want to see a team win that wins by this cheesy strategy of not partaking in the actual combat itself. I'm not knocking TSM or the other players who abused this. A few other teams did this as well. It was simply a good strategy given the rules and the format of the tournament, since placement counted for so much over kills. It was just the logical thing to do, but the PUBG definitely needs to change up either their rules or even change up the mechanics of the blue zone to prevent players from camping in it for so long. A Reddit thread opened up with players talking about how to try and fix the blue zone exploits in the game. Some people thought it would be good to have a secondary circle that comes that does increased damage after the first circle. So if you stay in the blue zone too long, you get hit by that and take extra damage. Other players thought it would be good to make it so that the further away you are from the white zone, the more damage you take. Personally, I think it would just make sense to increase your damage over time the longer you're in the blue zone, especially early to mid game. You will start taking a huge amount of damage, so you can't just stay in it forever and just camp and loot all game and then come in last second and try for the victory. It'll start doing too much damage. So I feel like there's a lot of things, a lot of different approaches that you could take, but basically players are saying that they don't want people to hang out in the blue zone for as long as they are. You shouldn't be killed immediately for getting stuck in the blue zone or maybe flipping your car in the blue zone. Hopefully there's a way to escape it. But ultimately, they don't want people to hang out in it for as long. And I agree, just both for casual play and for tournament play, it would generally be better and force players to fight each other more frequently. Another moment that occurred that was just frankly embarrassing for a tournament being watched by 100,000 people on Twitch and more elsewhere was the fact that the water mechanics were abused very, very harshly in certain games. Basically, the end circle came down to a point where there was a good amount of coastline in the circle, and a lot of players were just bobbing up and down in the water, abusing it to get end game positioning as best as they could. They couldn't really be killed while they're in the water because bullets don't really penetrate or go down below the surface level much. And it's very hard to hit your head when you're bobbing up and down in the water, and you can just dive down. So there's a point where just lots of players were abusing this mechanic. It looked silly. It wasn't entertaining to watch. And frankly, there's a lot of easy fixes to this problem. One simple fix is to allow players who are in the water to knife fight each other. Or maybe if you're bobbing up and down, you can shoot your pistol from above the surface of the water, something like that. Or, in addition to that, allow bullets to penetrate below the surface of the water. Now, they've done some tests with this on Mythbusters. It is true that once bullets impact the water, they generally shatter, and they don't really do much of anything beyond 1 foot of traveling through water. So it is true, water will protect you from incoming fire, but for the sake of gameplay, maybe get rid of this mechanic and allow people on land to actually shoot people in water, and it'll get rid of this cheesy mechanic. Now, of course, one area of the tournament that was probably discussed more than others was just the terrible camera work of the whole thing. I already did a video talking about just how bad the coverage was and how hard it was to follow the action. Some people have already made videos or started discussion topics saying, is this even a game that's possible to cover in an entertaining format where you can tell a good narrative because there's so many players and there's so much stuff happening all the time chaotically? Personally, I think it wouldn't be that hard to do. They just need to program the spectator mode a little bit differently. They had a whole bunch of different people watching like 16 screens at a time and one guy switching between them and all this stuff. And it definitely seemed like the main guy who was switching between the camera angles really didn't have that great of an understanding of PUBG, and you could tell at certain moments when it switched away from action and combat. But I feel like updating the spectator cam so that when one player shoots and it impacts another player, you could get a warning immediately as spectator, where if you just hit one quick key, it'll take you to that person's perspective. And better yet, if you can cue that into a delayed system where you get the warning say 10 seconds before it actually happens on your screen. So what you're watching as a spectator is delayed by 10 seconds. You can then switch to that person's perspective 10 seconds before the action occurs, and you can watch the whole firefight unveil. A little bit of programming, a little bit of stream delay mixed in there, and you could easily have one person watching a 100-player game in which you don't miss any of the crucial action. I really don't think it would be that hard. I can envision myself easily navigating through a spectator format in which it's set up properly to catch all the action. It shouldn't be that hard to do, and hopefully PUBG decides to put a lot of work into their spectator cam to make the tournament format much more interesting going forward. Now, at the end of the day, there were still hundreds of thousands of people that watched the tournament. There was a huge amount of interest in competitive PUBG, and overall, I mean, I would say it was successful in that we had a lot of entertaining moments, and if you're a huge PUBG fan, you probably still enjoyed watching the tournaments despite all of the weird errors and cheesy moments that occurred. And I think one of the best things at the end of all of it was that multiple devs came forward publicly and apologized for the quality of the tournament and some of the issues and errors that were occurring with it, and said that they want to make it better going forward. It was really nice to see Brendan Green come forward and say that in front of everybody. It was nice and refreshing, because I'm so used to working with these big AAA companies that are so freaked out about their public image and stock prices that they can never publicly apologize for anything or admit fault for anything. And so you've got these sort of closed off PR faces for these big companies, and PUBG and Bluehole have not become those companies yet, which is very nice, and they still have this sort of indie dev vibe to them. And so it was just nice to see them being honest and open with the community and saying, hey, there's a lot we want to fix and change about this going forward. And so hopefully we'll see some really, really nice changes for the future PUBG tournaments. I'd be excited to watch more of them, but as long as they make the necessary updates to fix Spectator and some of the rule sets. Let me know what you guys thought about the tournament in the chat below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.